Hello, grade 12 scholars, it's Ms. Novak, and we are in week 7, lesson 32 of your ELA Distance Learning. What can you expect from these lessons? Well, first of all, variety. We know that each lesson is different. Next, always a list of materials and resources that you'll need for your learning, an overview of the different components of learning. I'll make sure to model one of those components before you launch into it independently. And last but not least, a preview of the next lesson. Yesterday, we engaged in a close read of the first half of the poem, Escape from the Old Country. Today, we'll engage in a reread, a close read, of the second half of the poem, paying particular attention to the poet's intended audience. Today's video is ELA G12, W7, L32, and again, our task today is to reread lines 20 through 28 and answer questions and paraphrase these lines. Here are a few quick reminders before we start today's lesson. First, make sure that you're planning to share your learning with someone at home, a friend, a classmate. Just make sure that you understand the importance of discussing your learning with someone else. Next, complete the weekly fluency activity. This week's kind of cut short, so some of those activities might blend into each other. Just note that it's interesting to engage in fluency work partnered with a poem. And last but not least, make sure you have your book on deck and that you're logging your reading activity in your grade 12 learning packet. Here we are at our daily pictogram puzzle, or word puzzle of the day. Take a look at this image for 15 seconds or longer if you have to. Pause the video at that point. And think about what words or phrases this brings to mind. Take some time. And the answer is hole in one. Interesting. This is a very clever one. A little hole punch in that number 1 creates a hole in one. Anyways, I know that jogged my brain in action. Let's get ourselves going for today's lesson. Now it's time for the materials and resources. If you're anything like me, you might have a little workstation set up. Hopefully you do, so all of these materials are readily available. Just note that in your learning packet, lesson 32 is on page 99. Your note catcher is on page 100. The text is located on page 94, and you should have a pencil or pen, maybe a lucky one at this stage of the game. And really, that highlighter, if you have one, great. If not, try to find something with a different color, especially when we're engaged in close reading today. Here's a quick review. Note that we are still engaged with Escape from the Old Country by Adrienne Sue. The guiding question and essential question really are starting to resonate with me, especially because this poem is all about speaker and audience and intention and identity, all of these things. So keep the essential question, what does it mean to call a place home, top of mind? And let the guiding questions aid in your thinking and your imagination about the poem. Remember, you're paraphrasing at this point. So the first one, what makes a place important enough to write about? Think about the author's intention, right? And the next guiding question, in what ways is home both a place and a state of mind? Again, related to the author's contemplative kind of situation with her identity. Something to think about. Here's today's learning target. I can analyze how a poet's word choice determines their intended audience. So these two things are related, word choice and intended audience, and today it's up to us to make sense of that connection. Today we'll reread the poem, and we'll be focusing on a few lines in the second half of the piece. Then we will learn about point of view and audience, and think about the vantage point and intended audience of Escape from the Old Country. It's important that we really try to internalize the author's message. It might bend, shape, and mold itself over the course of the poem, which is why it's important to not shy away from reviewing our notes and our thoughts and ideas in the margins from previous lessons. So keep that in mind as you're looking at today's tasks and learning components. Let's examine the read, think, talk components of today's lesson. So what I'd like for you to do is to reread the poem. Yes, in its entirety, it's a good idea. And then pay particular attention to lines 20 to 24. Look at how the author describes tradition. What is the author trying to say tradition does? Share your thinking with a family member, caregiver, or friend, and deepen the conversation. Pause the video at this point to do just that. And before I forget, that little icon there, a little app symbol, if you have Pearson Bounce Pages app, it'd be a great time to utilize it so that you can hear the poem read aloud as you're engaging in your close read. Again, take some time to do this step now. Welcome back. I'd like to share with you the notes that I made when closely rereading lines 20 to 24. I took a lot of notes and engaged with the text a lot, but these lines jumped out at me, so I'm glad that we had a chance to analyze them closely. So first, I underlined the first few lines which talk about tradition and ancestors. I'd like to read those lines out loud to you now, starting with line 20. Tradition, unobserved, unasked, hangs on tight. Ancestors roam into reverie. I noted here that tradition is described as something that isn't really forgotten. One's heritage has a strong hold on one's life, and the influence of one's ancestors can be felt at many different moments, sometimes unannounced. It doesn't easily go away, so it hangs on tight and roam into reverie. Now, I'll be honest here, I really need to clarify what reverie meant. And so I saw it as a state of being pleasantly lost in one's thoughts or daydream. Right? We can't necessarily time our daydreams or what comes into them, but they're saying here that even ancestors can come into your thoughts, your heritage can play out into your everyday. I thought these were really pivotal lines to understanding the author's connection to her own heritage and cultural identity. Take some time to engage in a deeper discussion now with someone from home, hopefully generating some new insight. All right, now for the point of view. Next, I'd like to talk about the point of view and audience. Let's start with the point of view. So we know that point of view is the perspective or vantage point from which a story or poem is told. A point of view is determined by what type of voice is telling the story. In a poem that uses first-person point of view, the speaker provides the description and commentary from his or her own perspective, and the reader sees the world of the poem through the speaker's eyes. So it's almost as if we are inside of their experience. Let's take a look at our poem and determine where we see the first-person point of view popping up. Where do we identify most with the speaker's experience? Take a little time to internalize point of view, its meaning, and how it relates to our poem and how we receive the message. I'd like to engage in a quick review about the concept of audience. So in addition to a speaker, a poem might feature a specific audience. Poets leave clues to help readers determine who the audience may be. For example, a speaker uses direct address to speak directly to an audience. Speakers might name a specific person, or they might choose to use pronouns such as you and we to invite readers in to think of themselves as part of the audience. A speaker may also address an implied audience, or an audience that is hinted at but not explicitly revealed. If a poem has an implied audience, readers need to use clues to determine who the speaker is addressing. And this essentially is all what our lesson is about today. So let's get ready to take some notes down from this slide if we need to, and prepare ourselves to engage in the lesson activities. So the writing for today's lesson, I'll admit, is pretty heavy and requires a lot of thought. So let's make sure that we understand the nature of the questions and the terms that are used. Think about what I just told you about point of view and audience. Then look for clues about who the audience is supposed to be and make note of this in your note catcher. When you are finished, go back to the notes you made during your close reading and write an answer to this question. According to the poet, what does tradition do? I want to pause the video to complete that task now. And lastly, we're engaged in a paraphrasing effort, much like we were yesterday. But now we're paraphrasing the second half of the poem, lines 20 to 28 on the bottom of your note catcher. Remember, paraphrasing isn't capturing the poet's words word by word, let's say. You're really lifting up the salient and most important points of the poem so that someone else looking at your paraphrasing efforts has a general idea of what the poem is about. Take some time to pause the video and to complete these tasks. I know that I had a lot of questions when I first engaged with this lesson, so you might as well. And if you do, and they're not answered by a family member or friend, please note that you can always reach out to your teacher directly via email. Their first name, their last name at DetroitK12.org. I'm sure they would love to field questions, especially in relation to this lesson. Tomorrow, we have the privilege of engaging with the concept of theme. So tomorrow's learning target for lesson 33 is, I can determine the theme of a poem and connect it to the essential question of the unit. Now, you know that these are my favorite types of lessons, simply because it brings all of our learning forefront and center. And it features the essential question. So I'm really excited about that. I hope you are too. Thank you so much for engaging in this very thoughtful lesson today. I know there was a lot to handle, especially because we are doing back-to-back close reads of a very intense poem. So I really appreciate your participation. A few quick reminders before we turn it in for the day. Don't forget to talk about your lesson with someone. You might even want to extend this conversation and introduce talks about identity and heritage and what their cultural background has meant for them. Also, make sure that you engage in fluency practice, documenting your efforts in your learning packet. And last but not least, you know that I'm going to remind you to get your reading in. Don't set the timer for 20 minutes even. Let yourself go. You might even spend an hour. Who knows, depending on how much you like the reading material. Engage in these efforts, and you'll be ready to start in new and fresh tomorrow.